The settlers of the Great Plains had a saying that the land never lied. It showed you exactly what it was: flat, wide, merciless, and ancient, beyond anything a person could build in a single lifetime. It did not soften its edges for the weak. It did not hold back its wind for the grieving. And in the autumn of 1867, on a lonely stretch of Nebraska prairie where the grass had already turned the color of old bone, it was showing Eleanor Hale exactly what she was up against. She was 34 years old. She had brown eyes that had seen too much in too short a time, and hands that were already rougher than most men twice her age. She stood 5 feet 4 inches in worn leather boots, and she had not cried in 6 months. Not because she had no grief left, but because the grief had gone somewhere deeper than tears. It had settled into her spine, into the way she walked, into the set of her jaw, when she looked at something that needed doing and knew she was the only one left to do it. Her husband, Robert Hale, had died in April. The runoff that spring had been worse than anyone predicted. A wagon, a swollen creek crossing a wheel that caught wrong in the current. It had taken him in less than a minute, the kind of death the frontier handed out without ceremony, without warning, and without apology. One morning he was there planning the cabin they would finish before winter. By afternoon, Eleanor was standing at the edge of a creek bank with 3 children behind her and a silence in front of her that would never fully leave. She had stayed. That was the first thing people noticed, and the first thing they respected, though they expressed that respect mostly through silence. A widow with 3 children on a 160-acre claim in Nebraska, 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, with a half-built cabin that needed 2 strong men and 3 months of work she did not have. Most women would have gone back east. Most women would have taken the children and found family somewhere softer. Eleanor Hale stayed. Her oldest was Clara, 12 years old, with her father's sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped turning things over. Clara asked questions the way other children breathed constantly and without realizing she was doing it. She had cried at the creek bank that April day, the kind of crying that shakes a child's whole body. But she had also been the first one to start packing what needed to be packed and carrying what needed to be carried. She was her mother's daughter in the ways that counted. James was 9, all knees and elbows and unspent energy, the kind of boy who found purpose in motion and fell apart when he had nothing to do with his hands. He had taken his father's death hard, in the way that 9-year-old boys take hard things, by going very quiet for 2 weeks and then emerging from that quiet as if nothing had happened, throwing himself into every task with a ferocity that made Eleanor's chest ache to watch. Thomas was 6, small for his age, prone to coughs that lingered too long into spring, with a sensitivity to cold that had worried Eleanor even before the prospect of surviving a Nebraska winter without proper shelter became the central problem of her life. He was the one she thought about at night. He was the one who made the problem feel not just difficult, but urgent in a way that left no room for hesitation. The structure they had been living in since Robert's death was not a house. It had been a dugout, a temporary shelter carved into a low hillside on the eastern edge of their claim, meant to last one winter while the real cabin went up. Robert had shored it up with salvaged timber and packed clay. It kept the rain out and the wind mostly at bay. But the walls had been settling all summer, and by September, Eleanor could see the cracks spreading in 3 places along the ceiling. By November, it would not hold. By January, it might collapse entirely. The half-built cabin stood 60 yards away, its frame open to the sky, its walls 3 feet high on the best side and nothing but foundation stones on the others. Robert had been proud of the foundation. He had spent 2 weeks on it, measuring and leveling with the care that he brought to everything he built. Eleanor could not look at it without feeling the specific weight of something left unfinished. She had done the arithmetic the way a person does arithmetic, when the numbers keep coming out wrong, no matter how many times they try. To finish the cabin, she needed lumber, labor, and time. The lumber she might be able to get on credit from the mill in Harlan County, but the hauling alone would take 2 weeks of good weather, and good weather in October was a thing you could not plan around. The labor 2 strong men working steadily was simply not available to her. She was not strong enough to frame and raise walls alone, not with 3 children to feed and firewood to split, and a failing dugout to patch every week. And the time was the cruelest problem of all, because time was the one thing the calendar would not give her. October in Nebraska is not gentle. By the middle of the month, the temperature at night drops below freezing. By the end of the month, the ground has begun its long hardening toward the iron-solid state it will hold until March. And November on the Great Plains arrives like a judgment cold, and absolute, tolerating no one who has failed to prepare. Eleanor knew all of this. She had lived one Nebraska winter already. She knew what it could do. What she had not told anyone, not Amos Garrett, not his wife Bess, not a single soul in the small scatter of homesteads that passed for a community in their part of the county, was something she had noticed the previous winter. Something small. Something she had filed away in the part of her mind that held things not yet understood. The back wall of the dugout, the wall that was not built but simply carved from the hillside itself, the wall that was nothing but undisturbed earth pressed against the slope of the hill, had never gotten cold. Not truly cold. Not the bone-deep cold that settled into the other walls, the ones made of timber and clay and gaps that the wind found no matter how carefully you packed them. Those walls dropped below freezing on the worst nights. She had found ice on the inside of the wooden door more than once. But the back wall, the earth wall, had stayed at a temperature she could only describe as alive. Not warm like a fire, not warm like a body, but warm like something with a long memory. Steady in a way that nothing else in that winter had been steady. She had noticed it the way you notice things that don't fit the story you've been told. Filed it away, said nothing because there was nothing to say, and Robert had been there, and the problem of surviving winter had been his problem too, and they had solved it together the ordinary way with firewood and wool blankets in a stove that burned through more fuel than they had budgeted for. But Robert was gone now, and the ordinary way was no longer available to her. And on a morning in late September, sitting at the edge of the failing dugout with Thomas coughing behind her and the first real bite of autumn in the air, Eleanor had pulled that memory out of the place where she'd stored it and looked at it differently. Her mother had grown up in Kentucky. The farm there had a root cellar that Eleanor had played in as a child, a low room dug into a hillside dark and smelling of earth and stored apples cool in summer and warmer than you'd expect in winter. Her mother had called it the best refrigerator God ever made. The neighbors had one too, and their neighbors and their neighbors' neighbors. Everyone in the hills of Kentucky knew about root cellars. Nobody thought of them as remarkable. They were just part of how you manage food and temperature on a farm. But Eleanor's mind, sitting on that September morning, with the wind picking up from the northwest and the grass bending flat, made a connection that felt sudden but wasn't. It had been building for months, maybe longer, in the quiet space beneath every practical thought she'd had since April. What if the problem wasn't how to build something strong enough to keep the cold out? What if the problem was how to build something deep enough to get below the cold entirely? The frost line in Nebraska, the depth at which the ground stopped freezing, even in the worst of winters, was 3 to 4 feet down. She had heard Robert talk about it in the context of fence posts and foundation stones. Below that line, the earth held a temperature that didn't change much with the seasons. Not warm, but not frozen. Stable. If she dug down far enough, she would be below the reach of the winter entirely. If she dug far enough into the hillside, she would be surrounded on 3 sides and above by earth that had never in the memory of anyone living allowed itself to freeze. The cold could rage all it wanted at the surface. Below the frost line inside the hill, it would be like being held in the palm of something older and steadier than weather. She sat with this idea for 3 days before she said anything to anyone. She turned it over the way she turned over any decision that mattered, slowly from every angle, looking for the places where it broke down. She thought about ventilation. She thought about moisture in the walls. She thought about the weight of the earth above and what it would take to support it. She thought about the entrance tunnel and how to design it so cold air pooled at the lowest point instead of flooding the living space. None of it was beyond her. It was hard. It was physically demanding in ways she wasn't sure she could meet, but none of it was beyond her. On the 4th day, she walked over to the Garrett place. Amos Garrett was 55 years old, lean and weathered, with the particular quietness of a man who had spent decades learning that the land would humble you if you let your voice get louder than your work. He had come west from Ohio 12 years ago and built one of the most solid sod houses in the county, 2 rooms and a proper loft with walls thick enough that you barely heard the wind inside. He was not a man who talked much, but when he talked, people listened. His wife Bess was warmer in manner, a practical woman of 50 who had raised 4 children on the frontier and had the kind of steadiness that comes not from the absence of hardship, but from having survived so much of it that hardship has lost its power to surprise you. She had brought food to Eleanor after Robert died and had never once made Eleanor feel like charity was being received. Amos greeted Eleanor at his door with the measured courtesy of a man who had noticed that something in her posture had changed. She told him what she was thinking. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was actually considering it rather than preparing to dismiss it. "It could work," he said finally, "in principle." "But, Eleanor said, because she could hear the but coming. "But you'd be digging alone in October, with the ground already hardening." "I know. That's 6 weeks of work for two men working together." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "I'll send James over when I can spare him." He meant his son James Garrett, a broad-shouldered 20-year-old who had his father's quiet competence. "Not every day, but some." "Thank you," Eleanor said. Bess had stood in the doorway through all of this. When Amos finished, she added without preamble, "The children are welcome here through winter, Eleanor, all three of them. The loft is warm, you know that." The offer was genuine, it was kindly meant, and it carried beneath its kindness a truth that everyone in the room understood without saying, that what Eleanor was proposing was a long shot, and that if it failed, there needed to be somewhere safe for the children to go. Eleanor thanked her. She did not accept. She walked home through a wind that had picked up since morning, and she spent that evening thinking not about whether to proceed, but about exactly how. What she did not know yet was that someone else had already heard about her plan. Virgil Cross had been the best carpenter in that part of Nebraska for 20 years. He was 58 years old, a big man gone somewhat to weight since his own farming days, with thick hands that could read the grain of a piece of wood the way some men read a book. He had built 3 of the county's best cabins and repaired nearly every structure within 30 miles at one time or another. He had opinions about construction the way other men had opinions about religion, with conviction, with detail, and with an impatience for anyone who hadn't put in the years to earn the right to disagree. He had also, in the months since Robert Hale's death, twice ridden past the Hale claim and observed the situation with the professionally assessing eye of a man who saw problems and solutions simultaneously. He had noted the failing dugout. He had noted the unfinished cabin frame. He had done the arithmetic. 3 days after Eleanor spoke to Amos Garrett, Virgil Cross rode up to the Hale claim on a gray Tuesday morning and tied his horse to the fence post that marked the edge of the vegetable patch. Eleanor was splitting wood near the dugout entrance. She looked up as he approached. He introduced himself, though she knew who he was. Everyone knew who Virgil Cross was. He laid out his proposal with the efficiency of a man who had thought it through. He would finish the cabin. Not a quick job, not a rough job, a proper cabin. 2 rooms, a real loft, a chimney of fieldstone. He had done it before, and he knew how long it would take and what it would require. In exchange, he was asking for 40 acres on the eastern edge of her claim, the flat portion along the creek. It was not an unfair offer. 40 acres for a finished cabin that would last 20 years was a trade that made sense on paper. Eleanor looked at him and listened to all of it and did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Cross. I've decided on a different approach." He looked at her the way a man looks when he hears something he wasn't prepared for. She told him briefly what she was planning. The silence that followed was not the kind Amos Garrett had offered, the kind that meant careful consideration. This silence was the particular silence of a man whose professional identity has just been casually set aside by someone he doesn't think is qualified to set it aside. "A dugout," he said, "an earth shelter, deeper than a dugout, properly designed. You're going to dig into that hill." He said it the way you say something to make sure you've heard it correctly. "Yes, with winter coming in 6 weeks. Starting tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at the hillside, at the dugout entrance, at the unfinished cabin frame. He put his hat back on his head with a deliberateness that communicated exactly what he thought of the plan. "Mrs. Hale," he said, with a careful courtesy that was thinner than he intended it to sound, "I've been building on this prairie for 20 years. I've never seen anything dug into a hill that a family could live through a Nebraska winter in. Root cellars are for potatoes, not for children." "I understand your concern," Eleanor said. "Thank you for coming." He rode away. Within 48 hours, the story had traveled the way stories travel on a prairie, which is to say faster than seemed physically possible given the distances involved. By the time Eleanor drove her first spade into the hillside on a cold Thursday morning in early October, the community had already sorted itself into two positions. Most people felt something between skepticism and quiet worry. A few, mostly the older ones, felt genuine alarm. Virgil Cross felt something else. He felt something that a man of his experience and standing is not supposed to feel when a widow with no building background ignores his professional advice and tries something he has publicly declared impossible. He felt the particular discomfort of a man who cannot afford to be wrong, but has not yet determined whether he is. He did not go back to the Hale claim. But he started paying close attention to the reports that came through the community about how the digging was going. Eleanor knew none of this on that October morning. What she knew was the feel of the spade in her hands and the resistance of the earth and the angle of the slope and how to read the color of the soil for moisture content and stability. She knew it was going to be hard. She had not understood until the spade went in for the first time exactly how hard. Nebraska soil in October is not frozen yet, but it is no longer cooperative. The summer's heat has baked the top layers to a density that resists easy breaking. Below that, the earth is damp and heavy, and moving it requires not just effort, but a kind of sustained, rhythmic, patient violence against the ground that drains the body in ways that don't show up until the second day, when everything from the shoulders down announces its displeasure all at once. Eleanor worked for 5 hours the first morning. She dug the opening 8 feet wide, positioned on the north face of the hill, where the slope was steepest and the soil most stable. She cleared the first 4 feet of depth and began shaping the downward angle of the entrance tunnel. By noon, her hands had blistered in 3 places. By 3 in the afternoon, she had stopped feeling her fingers with any precision and was working by the pressure of her palms against the handle. Clara brought water twice and stood watching, with the expression of someone who had not yet decided whether to be worried or impressed. James carried 2 buckets of removed clay to the growing pile downhill without being asked. Thomas sat at the dugout entrance with a piece of firewood and a small knife, carving nothing in particular, casting occasional glances at his mother, with the radar of a 6-year-old who can sense when an adult is pushing past a comfortable limit. At the end of the first day, Eleanor had moved more earth than she had thought herself capable of moving. She had also established in her own body and her own mind the terms of what the next 6 weeks were going to require from her. She didn't sleep well that night, but she slept. Amos Garrett's son James came 4 times in the first 2 weeks, and his contribution was significant. He was young and strong and willing to follow Eleanor's direction without second-guessing her. But he had his own farm work and his own family's preparation for winter, and Eleanor did not ask for more than could be given freely. She understood the economy of obligation on the frontier. Mostly she dug alone, 12 feet into the hill. The tunneling required a different technique than the initial excavation, slower and more careful shoring, as she went with salvaged timber from the unfinished cabin frame. Robert's foundation stones, which he had set with such precision, became the basis for the floor of the living chamber. She shaped the room itself 14 feet across and 8 feet from floor to ceiling, sloping the ceiling slightly toward the rear to encourage warm air to pool where the living happened. She carved a long entrance tunnel lower than the main chamber design so that cold air, which is heavy and settles downward, would drain toward the tunnel opening and away from the room where her children would sleep. She built a ventilation shaft in the rear, angled upward through the hill, capped with a salvaged piece of pipe that allowed air to move without letting weather in. She packed the walls with a mixture of clay and dry grass, the same technique the prairie grasses themselves used to survive, layering, insulating, becoming part of the earth rather than fighting it. She built the entrance door from the heaviest timber he had, hung it inward, so that the weight of accumulated snow on the hillside would press it tighter into its frame rather than forcing it open. She built a second door at the inner end of the entrance tunnel, a small thing barely 4 feet high, positioned so that anyone entering would have to drop to a crouch and then step up into the main chamber. This simple 6-inch rise from the tunnel floor to the chamber floor, was the detail she was most pleased with. Cold air cannot climb. It pools at the lowest point available. 6 inches was the difference between the cold staying in the tunnel and the cold reaching her children's feet while they slept. She knew these things not from books. She knew them from the Kentucky hills, from her mother's voice explaining why the root cellar stayed cool in summer, from afternoons spent as a child with her fingers pressed against the earth walls of that underground room, feeling something she hadn't had a word for then but understood now, the Earth's memory. The way it absorbed and held and released temperature on a schedule measured not in hours but in weeks and months and seasons. The Earth didn't experience winter the way the surface did. Below the frost line, it barely experienced it at all. 12 days into the construction on a moonless night in mid-October, Eleanor woke to the sound of something outside. She lay still for a moment listening. The children were asleep. The failing dugout was quiet. Outside, the wind was steady from the northwest, and beneath it she heard, or thought she heard, the sound of something moving on the hillside. She got up quietly and went to the dugout entrance and looked out. She could see nothing in the darkness. The night was thick and starless under cloud cover, and the hillside was just a shape against the sky. She stood for several minutes listening. In the morning, she went to the construction site. A section of the newly packed clay wall on the left side of the entrance tunnel, a section she had spent most of a morning carefully laying in, had been disturbed. Not collapsed, not completely destroyed, but broken at the surface as if something, a tool or a heavy boot, had struck it a dozen times with deliberate force. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she got her spade and her bucket and her clay mixture, and she repaired it. She told no one. The work continued. There was an afternoon in the third week when Clara came to the site and sat on a piece of timber watching her mother work, and did not say anything for a long time. Eleanor had learned to read her daughter's silences the way she read weather, by texture, by duration, by what came before. "What is it?" Eleanor said, not stopping her work. Clara was quiet for another moment. "Ned Hutchinson's boy, Henry, he said you're going to kill us." "Henry Hutchinson is 10 years old. He said his father said it." Eleanor pulled a load of clay out of the tunnel and set it down, straightened, and looked at her daughter. Clara's face was doing the thing it did when she was frightened, but had decided that showing fear was not useful. It was, Eleanor thought, the bravest face she had ever seen on a 12-year-old. "What do you think?" Eleanor said. Clara looked at the hill, at the dark rectangle of the tunnel entrance, at the growing shape of the structure that didn't look like anything a person was supposed to live in. "I think," she said slowly, "that you don't do things without reasons." "I don't," Eleanor said. "I just need to understand the reason." So Eleanor sat down on the timber next to her daughter and explained as carefully as she knew how what happens to the earth below the frost line, what a frost line was, why the back wall of the old dugout had stayed warm all last winter when everything else had been cold, what a root cellar was and why it worked, what the earth stored and how it released it. She drew in the dirt with a stick, the layers of soil, the frost line, the stable temperature zone below the design of the shelter, and how each part served a purpose. Clara listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Eleanor finished, Clara studied the drawing in the dirt for a moment. Then she said, "It's like a battery." "I suppose it is," Eleanor said. "The earth charges up during the warm months and releases it during the cold months." "That's almost exactly right." Clara nodded slowly in the particular way that meant she had filed the information into the correct place and was now building on top of it. "Then the question isn't whether it will be warm enough," she said. "The question is whether we can finish in time." "Yes," Eleanor said, "that's the question." It was the third week of October. They had perhaps 4 weeks before the first serious cold would arrive. Eleanor did the arithmetic again in her head, standing next to her daughter on the hillside. It was going to be close. She went back to work. What happened 3 days later is something Eleanor had not anticipated, and not because she hadn't thought about interference. She had thought about it. What she hadn't anticipated was where it would come from and how it would feel when she found the evidence. She had gone to the Garrett place for a tool. She'd broken a reinforcing iron rod she'd been using to probe the soil before each day's digging. Amos had a spare. She was gone for 4 hours, taking Thomas with her, because his cough had been worse that week, and Bess Garrett had some dried elderberries she'd offered for it. When she came back, the section of completed wall above the tunnel entrance, the outside facing the part she had taken the most care with, because it bore the most weight, had been struck and partially collapsed. Not by weather. The marks were too deliberate. The angle was wrong for a natural fall. Someone had come while she was away and done this carefully enough to look at a glance like a settling. But Eleanor knew her work. She knew every joint, every layer, every angle. This had not settled. This had been struck. She put Thomas inside the old dugout. She sat down on the hillside in the cold afternoon air, and she stayed very still for a long time looking at the damage. She thought about who knew her schedule, who knew she'd be gone, who had the knowledge to do this in a way that might pass as accident. She thought about Virgil Cross. She was not angry in the way that comes hot and fast. She was angry in the deeper way, the way that comes when something confirms a fear you have been carrying and hoping was wrong. She sat with it until it had settled into something that felt less like feeling and more like fuel. Then she got up and went to work. She repaired the wall. She improved it this time, using a different technique, interlocking the clay sections the way her grandfather had described old stone walls in England, each piece supporting the ones beside it, so that no single point bore all the load and a single blow could no longer knock out a section cleanly. It was better than what she had built before. She told no one. The shelter was completed on the 20th of November. Not finished in the fine-tuned sense, there were details she would have liked to refine, smoothings and adjustments and secondary improvements she had planned but not yet made. But completed in the essential sense, the room was sealed, the roof was solid, the entrance tunnel was functional, the ventilation shaft was open, the doors were hung. She spent 2 days moving the family's necessary belongings in. The iron stove, small enough to have been called modest, even by the standards of the time. The wool blankets and the feather ticks. Robert's tools, which she kept not because she would use all of them, but because she could not yet bear to sell them. The heirlooms from Kentucky, her mother's tin box, the Bible, the small piece of blue glass that had sat on every windowsill in every home Eleanor could remember. The dried herbs, the stored food. On the 22nd of November, under a sky the color of pewter that promised snow before morning, Eleanor moved her children into the earth shelter. Clara went first, ducking through the low outer door, moving through the entrance tunnel in the half-crouch it required, stepping up the 6-inch rise into the main chamber. She stood inside for a moment, adjusting to the light, which came from 2 oil lanterns Eleanor had hung from the ceiling timber. Then she put her hand against the back wall, the earth wall, the wall that pressed deep into the hillside, and held it there. Eleanor watched her daughter's face from the tunnel entrance. "It's warm," Clara said, not with the enthusiasm of a child discovering something pleasant, with the precise, careful tone of a person confirming a hypothesis they had not fully dared to believe. "Yes," Eleanor said. James was already past them both, examining the corners, knocking on the timber supports with the knuckle wrap that small boys use to test the solidity of structures. "It's like a fort," he said approvingly. Thomas stood in the middle of the room, looking at the curved ceiling, at the dark earth walls, at the lantern light playing across the clay. His cough had been better the last 2 days, for reasons Eleanor suspected had something to do with the damp in the old dugout being replaced by the different, drier quality of the air inside the hill. He turned slowly, taking it in. "It's quiet," he said. He meant the wind. Outside, the November wind was its usual insistent self, pushing at the hillside, moving across the prairie, with the blunt force of something that had nothing between it and the Rockies to slow it down. Inside the chamber, it was a suggestion, a distant commentary, something that happened to other people. That night, the first snow of the season fell. Eleanor lay in her bedroll in the dark, listening to the sounds of her children sleeping, and felt the temperature of the air around her, and thought about the weeks ahead, and about Virgil Cross, and about what Robert had written in the letter Clara had found. The letter. She had not yet told anyone about the letter. She had found it 3 weeks into the digging, when she was clearing the last of the old dugout's back wall to use the timber from it. The floor near the base of the east wall, the spot where Robert had always set his toolbox when he came in from working, had a piece of flat stone laid slightly off from the others. She had noticed it because she knew those stones. She had helped lay them. And that one was not where she had put it. Under the stone was a tin box the same size as the one her mother had used for sewing supplies, sealed with a small latch rusted nearly shut. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth against moisture, was a folded piece of paper, Robert's handwriting, careful and upright the way he always wrote when he was writing something he meant to last. "Eleanor, I don't know when you'll find this. I'm putting it here because I believe in keeping something where it belongs, which is to say close to the ground and close to the things that matter. This claim is good land. You know it better than I do, if I'm honest. You always had the eye for what the land was trying to say. If I'm not here and you're reading this, then something went wrong, and I'm sorry for that more than I can put down in words. But I'm not sorry we came, and I'm not sorry we built what we built. Don't let anyone tell you what this land can and can't do for you. Don't let anyone build your life for you. Trust what you know. The earth in this hill is good earth. I used to press my hand against the back wall on cold nights and think that whatever made that wall warm was older than our trouble. Trust what you know. R. Eleanor had read the letter 3 times in the cold October light, sitting at the base of the hill, with clay on her hands and her children somewhere behind her. Then she had folded it back into the oilcloth, put it in the tin box, and carried it inside, and put it on the shelf she had built into the east wall of the new chamber, next to the blue glass from her mother's windowsill. She had not cried. The grief was somewhere she couldn't reach anymore, or perhaps somewhere it had transformed into something that looked from the outside like work. Now, on the first night in the new shelter with snow falling outside and 3 children breathing quietly around her, and the earth pressing close on all sides with that steady ancient warmth she had first noticed a year ago and trusted with everything she had, she lay still in the dark and thought about what Robert had written. The earth in this hill is good earth, he had known. Not in the systematic, designed way she had approached it, not with the frost lines and the thermal mass and the entrance tunnel calculations. But he had pressed his palm against that wall on cold nights and felt what she had felt, and he had written it down and he had buried it in the ground, which was, she supposed, where it had always belonged. Outside, the snow came down on the Nebraska prairie without mercy or sentiment, covering the half-built cabin frame and the failing old dugout and the strange low mound in the hillside with its small wooden door. It covered Amos Garrett's solid sod house and Ned Hutchinson's drafty shanty and Virgil Cross's well-built cabin, and it lay on all of them with the same impartial weight, making no distinctions. But inside the hill, the temperature had not changed. It was 58 degrees when she had moved the family in that afternoon. By the time Eleanor finally closed her eyes, it had risen to 61, the warmth of 3 children and 1 adult and 2 oil lanterns slowly feeding the walls what the walls had been waiting for. The earth receives, the earth holds, the earth gives back. Clara had called it a battery. Eleanor thought that was close, but not quite. She thought it was more like a covenant, a thing you entered into with the land not by demanding from it, but by listening to what it had been trying to say all along. The snow fell, the wind moved across the prairie. Inside the hill in the dark, Eleanor Hale slept. She had 4 weeks before the real winter arrived. She did not know it yet, but Virgil Cross had ridden past the hill that afternoon just before the snow started and had stopped his horse and looked at the finished mound from the road for a long time. He had not gotten off his horse. He had not approached. He had looked at it the way a man looks at something he has decided is a mistake, but with the faint, uncomfortable attention of a man who is beginning to wonder if the mistake might be his own. He had ridden on without stopping. The snow covered his tracks by morning as it covered everything, as it would cover the whole of the Nebraska prairie in the weeks to come, until the only thing that mattered, the only question the land was actually asking, was which of the structures men and women had built could hold against what was coming. December was 3 weeks away, and somewhere to the northwest, building itself slowly over the Rockies, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world, the storm of 1867 was beginning to take shape. The 18th of December arrived without announcement. That was the thing about the worst storms on the Great Plains. They did not announce themselves the way lesser storms did, with dramatic skies and shifting winds, and the kind of atmospheric theater that gave experienced homesteaders time to prepare. The worst ones came quietly. A drop in temperature that felt at first like nothing more than the ordinary cold of a December morning. A sky that went from gray to white so gradually that you didn't notice the change until the change was complete. A stillness in the air that lasted just long enough to be mistaken for calm. Eleanor noticed none of these signs because she was not looking for them. She was inside the shelter repairing a section of the ventilation shaft cover that had loosened in a wind 3 nights before. Thomas was beside her, holding the tools she needed in the order she needed them, with the focused attention he brought to anything that involved being useful to his mother. Clara was reading from the family Bible, her voice soft and even in the way it had been since they moved into the shelter, as if the acoustics of the earth room had taught her a new register. James had gone out at first light to check on the cow they kept in a small, lean-to structure built against the south face of the hill, protected enough from the worst weather to survive it, but not what anyone would call comfortable. James came back in 20 minutes later, moving faster than he'd left. "Something's coming," he said. Eleanor set down her tools and looked at her son. His cheeks were the particular color they got when the cold had worked on them hard and fast, not the slow pink of ordinary winter weather, but the sharp red of temperature falling quickly. "How far?" she said. "Can't see the Garrett place anymore," he said. "It was clear when I went out." Eleanor stood up, told Thomas to stay inside, and went to the outer door of the entrance tunnel. She opened it 6 inches and looked out. The Garrett place was a mile and a quarter to the northwest, visible on clear days as a dark rectangle against the sky. She had seen it that morning when she'd gone out before dawn to check the temperature and the stars. Now the northwest was a wall of white, not falling snow, but moving snow horizontal, a curtain of it being driven by a wind she could already hear beginning to find the door edges. She closed the door, latched it, stood in the tunnel for a moment thinking. She had prepared for this. The firewood for the small stove was inside. The food stores were inside. The water barrel was inside. The medical kit, what there was of one, was inside. The extra blankets were on the shelf. She had thought about this moment in the way that a person thinks about something they are building against, methodically room by room and item by item, and she had done everything she could do. She went back inside and told her children the storm had arrived. Clara looked up from the Bible. "How bad?" "Bad," Eleanor said. "Stay inside. Don't open the outer door unless I ask you to." She did not say, "I don't know how long." She did not say, "I'm not sure what's coming." She said it the way she said everything in those weeks, plainly, with the information her children needed and without the fear they didn't need to carry. Within 2 hours, the outside world had ceased to exist. That was the only way to describe what happened when a blizzard of that scale settled over the prairie. It did not gradually worsen. It arrived at its full intensity with a totality that was almost administrative, as if winter had simply decided to be finished with half measures and had committed itself entirely. The wind hit a sustained pitch that went beyond sound into something closer to pressure, a constant physical force that pushed against the hillside with a weight you could feel through the earth. Outside, in a world Eleanor could no longer see, the temperature was dropping. She would learn the numbers later from Amos Garrett, who had kept a careful log, because he was the kind of man who kept careful logs of things he wanted to understand. At 9 in the morning on December 18th, the temperature at the Garrett place had been 12 degrees above zero. By noon, it had fallen to 4 below. By 4 in the afternoon, 15 below. By midnight, it had reached 22 below zero, and the wind was driving snow hard enough that a man who walked 50 feet from his own front door could lose his bearings entirely. Eleanor knew none of these numbers as they were happening. She knew only what the shelter told her, which was almost nothing. The wind was a distant roar, like standing near a waterfall in the dark, present, constant, and strangely abstract. The temperature inside the chamber had dropped 2 degrees from its stable 68 since the storm began. She tracked it by feel, pressing her palm against the wall at intervals, reading the slight changes in the clay's surface temperature, the way her mother had read weather in the behavior of animals. The walls were giving back what they had stored, slowly and steadily, the way a hearthstone gives back the day's warmth through the night. She lit the small iron stove at noon, not for heat, but for cooking. She made a corn mush that she thickened with a little salt pork fat, and they ate it in the orange light of the stove, in the steadier light of the 2 oil lanterns, in the temperature in the chamber. Rose not because of the stove. The stove was far too small to heat a space this size, but because the act of cooking and eating and the warmth of 4 bodies in a sealed room was adding to what the walls already held. James ate quickly and asked to go check on the cow again. "No," Eleanor said, "she'll be cold. She has the lean-to and the body heat of herself. She'll manage. You won't." He didn't argue. He knew by then that his mother's no's on matters of safety were not the beginning of a negotiation. Clara read. Thomas fell asleep against Eleanor's shoulder in the early afternoon, which he did when the barometric pressure changed. She had noticed this about him the previous winters, that his body responded to atmospheric shifts by going very still and very quiet, as if something in him understood that rest was the right response to weather he couldn't control. She let him sleep. The first day passed. They were careful with the lamp oil, burning 1 lantern at a time except during meals. In the gaps between the room held a darkness that was not frightening. It was the dark of enclosed spaces that are safe, different in quality from the dark of open places that are not. Eleanor had grown up knowing this difference from the root cellar in Kentucky, where she had spent summer afternoons when the heat outside was too much, sitting in the cool dark with the smell of earth and apples around her, feeling held rather than confined. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the children slept, listening to the storm work itself against the hillside, and thought about the other families in the settlement. She thought about Amos and Bess Garrett in their solid sod house, burning through their firewood, keeping two stoves going, watching the temperature inside drop, despite everything they were feeding into it. Amos would be up every 2 hours adding wood. He was that kind of man, disciplined, methodical, unwilling to let a system fail through inattention. She thought about the Hutchinson place, which was a frame shanty that Ned Hutchinson had built in a hurry 2 years ago and had been meaning to improve ever since. She had been inside it once the previous winter and had noted the gaps in the chinking that the wind found even on ordinary days. On a night like this one, those gaps would be admitting air cold enough to freeze water on the inside of the walls. She thought about other families she knew less well, scattered across the country in structures of varying quality, all of them doing the same arithmetic tonight. How much wood is left? How long can we hold the temperature? What do we burn when the wood runs out? She did not think about Virgil Cross. She slept. The second day of the storm was worse than the first, in one way only, but that one way was enough. Thomas woke in the small hours of the second night. She knew it was the second night because she had been tracking the time, carefully noting the lamp oil consumption and the intervals between sleeping and waking with a heat in him that had nothing to do with the shelter's warmth. She pressed the back of her hand against his forehead and felt the dry, papery heat of a fever that had been building while he slept. He was 6 years old. He was the smallest of her children. He had lungs that had never been entirely reliable. Eleanor had been afraid of this. Not in the active, anxious way, but in the quiet background way that a person who knows their risk carries that knowledge. She had prepared for it. In the tin box that had held Robert's letter, the letter now on its shelf, the box repurposed, she kept the things her mother had taught her. Dried elderberry, dried thyme, a small wrapped piece of beeswax infused with something she had prepared from dried yarrow and dried chamomile. The previous autumn, following instructions her mother had given her from memory of instructions, her own mother had given her a chain of women's knowledge passed down through a world where doctors were scarce, and what the land provided was often all there was. She lit the stove with the quietness of someone who has decided exactly what needs doing and is doing it without wasted motion. She heated water. She made a preparation from the elderberry and thyme, weak enough for a child, sweetened with the last of a small piece of hard sugar she had saved. She held Thomas up against her and spooned it into him slowly, and then sat with him pressed against her chest, his forehead against her collarbone, while the stove warmed the air around them and the walls held steady. Clara was awake. She had not said anything, but Eleanor could see her eyes reflecting the stove light from across the room, open and watching. "Go back to sleep," Eleanor said quietly. "Is he bad?" Clara said. "He's got a fever. I'm handling it." A pause. Should we go for Bess Garrett? Eleanor thought about this with the full weight it deserved. The Garrett place was 1.25 miles away. The temperature outside was somewhere below zero. The wind was a wall. A person who went out into that wind in that dark on ground they couldn't see could lose their direction within 50 yards, could walk the wrong way and keep walking and never find anything again. "No," she said. Clara absorbed this. "Can you fix it?" "I'm going to try," Eleanor said, which was as honest as she could be. She stayed awake the entire second night. She administered the elderberry preparation every 2 hours, small spoonfuls, watching Thomas's face in the lantern light for the changes that would tell her whether it was working. She kept his feet warm with her own body heat. She changed the damp cloth on his forehead. She talked to him in a low, steady voice about things she remembered from Kentucky, the creek behind her mother's house, the sound the wind made in the poplars there, which was nothing like the sound it made on the prairie, being softer and more musical, as if the trees had learned to translate it into something a child could sleep to. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas's breathing changed, deepened, became the slow, deliberate breathing of real sleep rather than the shallow, interrupted rhythm of fever rest. Eleanor pressed her hand against his forehead, still warm, but the dry, papery heat had softened. Moisture at his temples. The fever was beginning to yield. She exhaled, slowly. In the dark, with the storm still pressing against the hillside outside, she let herself feel the full weight of what the last few hours had been, and then she let it go because there was no room for it. She stayed awake until dawn, not because Thomas needed her to, because she needed to be sure. The third day, Thomas was weak but cooler. He lay on his bedroll and watched the ceiling with the particular patience of a child who has been sick and knows recovery requires stillness. James, who hero-worshipped his younger brother in the physical, unspoken way of 9-year-old boys, sat beside him and taught him a card game with a battered deck that had been their father's. Clara organized the food stores not because they needed organizing, but because she was her mother's daughter, and when she was frightened, she found something useful to do with her hands. The temperature in the shelter had settled at 66 degrees. Eleanor had tracked it through the storm with the thermometer she had bought in Harlan County in October, specifically for this purpose, writing the readings in the back of a small notebook she had brought from Kentucky. 3 times a day, first morning, noon, and last light. The readings formed a line that was almost flat: 68, 67, 67, 66, 66. The storm had taken 2 degrees, 2 degrees in 3 days against an outside temperature that had reached 22 below zero. She looked at those numbers and felt something that was not quite pride. She had built the shelter too deliberately for it to be pride, the way a carpenter doesn't feel pride when a joint holds only the quiet confirmation that the work was done correctly. What she felt was closer to gratitude for the earth, for what it was willing to do if you asked it correctly. It was on the evening of the third day when the wind had shifted slightly, still fierce but with a different quality, the quality of a storm that has spent itself somewhat and is running on duration now, rather than intensity, that she heard the sound at the outer door. She heard it because the wind had dropped for 30 seconds in the way it does, sometimes taking a breath before the next gust, and in that 30 seconds, the sound came through clearly. 3 impacts against the door. Not a knock exactly. The arm that made them didn't have enough strength for a proper knock. More like the sound of something falling against the door repeatedly. Eleanor was on her feet before she had consciously decided to move. She went through the low inner door into the tunnel in a crouch, moving toward the outer door. She could feel the cold intensifying as she moved through the tunnel. It was working exactly as designed. The cold air, heavy and pooled in the lower entrance passage, kept back from the living chamber by the 6-inch rise. She reached the outer door and held still for a moment, listening. The sound came again, faint, deliberate in the way that only a conscious creature can make a sound deliberate when it no longer has much left to work with. She opened the door. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. In the fraction of a second before the wind drove snow into her eyes and she had to shield them, she saw the shape on the ground just outside the entrance. Large, dark, folded wrong, in the way a person folds when they no longer have the strength to hold themselves upright. She did not stop to think about who it was. She bent, got her hands under the person's arms and pulled. He was heavy. Heavier than she expected, a large man gone limp with cold, and she had to pull in stages, bracing herself against the tunnel walls, moving him in increments until he was inside far enough that she could close the outer door behind them. She pulled it shut, latched it, crouched in the cold dark of the tunnel with the man's weight across her legs, and waited for her eyes to adjust. She could hear his breathing, shallow, labored. But there, she got the inner door open, and in the light from the lantern, she saw his face. Virgil Cross. He was barely conscious. His lips had gone the particular dark color that happens when circulation has been withdrawing from the extremities for too long. His hands, when she pulled off the stiff gloves that had frozen half solid, were the wrong color, not white, which would have been better, but the mottled gray-purple that means the cold has done serious work. His coat was inadequate for what he'd been in. She could see ice crystals in the fabric where his breath had condensed and frozen. She looked at him for exactly the length of time it took her to assess what needed doing. Then she pulled him still in the stages out of the tunnel and up the 6-inch step and into the chamber. The warmth of the room hit him visibly. A small tremor moved through his body, the first sign of returning sensation. Clara was standing against the far wall, watching with her father's eyes. "Get the extra blanket," Eleanor said. "The wool one." Clara got it. James had gone very still in the corner near Thomas, watching with the focused attention of a boy who understands that he should stay out of the way and is doing so perfectly. Eleanor worked on Virgil Cross the way she had worked on everything in the last 2 months, methodically, without wasted motion, doing what needed doing in the order it needed doing. She got the frozen outer layers off him. She wrapped him in the wool blanket. She did not put him too close to the stove, which would have been the instinct because bringing circulation back too fast does its own damage. She positioned him against the back wall, this earth wall, the warmest surface in the room, and she put her own hands around his and held them. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. This man had tried to stop her from building the thing that was currently keeping him alive. She was aware of that in the way you are aware of something you've decided not to hold. She was keeping him alive because he was a human being in her doorway in a blizzard, and there was no other possible response to that, and what had happened between them before the blizzard was a separate matter that would have its own time. After 20 minutes, Virgil Cross opened his eyes fully. He lay against the earth wall with the wool blanket around him and looked at the curved ceiling and then looked at Eleanor, who had moved to the stove to heat water. He said nothing. She could see him becoming aware of his surroundings in stages, the warmth, the light, the earth walls, the three children watching him, with the measured caution of children who have been taught not to speak before they understand a situation. He tried to sit up, managed it slowly. Eleanor set a cup of hot water near him. Plain water, the heat of it more important than any medicine she might have added. He took the cup in his still, clumsy hands and held it. The temperature in the room was 66 degrees. Outside, by Eleanor's estimate, it was still somewhere below zero, and the storm was still running, and it would run for another full day before it finally exhausted itself. Virgil Cross sat in the warmth with the cup in his hands and said nothing for a long time. Then very quietly he said, "My roof went." When Eleanor said, "Last night, the west side, the snow load," she nodded. She had worried about that possibility with some of the structures in the settlement, the ones built with shallower roof pitches that allowed snow to accumulate rather than shedding it. "I walked," he said. "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought I knew which direction." "You were close," she said. "Another 100 yards, and you'd have missed us entirely." He absorbed this. Clara was watching him with the careful, intelligent attention she brought to everything. She had recognized him, Eleanor could see that, and she was old enough to understand something of what his presence here meant. She said nothing. Eleanor was proud of her for that. Virgil looked around the room slowly. At the thick ceiling, the earth walls, the entrance tunnel, low door, the cold stove. He held the cup of hot water, and he felt the warmth, and he took in the temperature and what it meant, and his face did something that a man of his particular pride does not show easily. It did the thing that happens when a person has been wrong in a way that has cost not just himself but others. "How long has it been this warm?" he said. "Since we moved in," Eleanor said, "the 22nd of November. He looked at the stove. "That's not doing it." "No," she said. "That's just for cooking." He pressed one hand against the earth wall beside him. The clay was cool to the touch, the way the back of a stone is cool, not cold, but cool in the way of something that has absorbed a great deal and is releasing it slowly. "The walls," he said, "and the depth," Eleanor said, "and the entrance tunnel, and the roof thickness, and the position in the hill." He was quiet again. The storm made its sounds outside and inside the chamber. There was the small hiss of the lantern and the breathing of children and the occasional shift of Thomas adjusting his position on his bedroll. "I rode past," Virgil said, 3 weeks ago, after you'd finished." "I know," Eleanor said. "I saw you." He looked at her. "You stopped your horse," she said. "You were there for about 5 minutes." Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Guilt, perhaps, though a man like Virgil Cross carried guilt the way certain stones carry heat, deeply, not visibly radiating it slowly without showing it on the surface. "My shanty would have been fine," he said, not defensively, factually, the way a craftsman acknowledges the limits of an assessment, "in an ordinary winter." "I know," she said. "This isn't an ordinary winter." He nodded slowly. "No," he said, "it isn't." Clara had gone back to her Bible, or appeared to. Eleanor knew her daughter well enough to know that she was not reading a word of it. James had let out a long breath from his corner and picked up the card game with Thomas again, with the exaggerated casualness of a 9-year-old who has decided everything is going to be fine and wants to demonstrate this by acting as if it already was. Thomas looked at Virgil Cross with the open, unguarded curiosity of a 6-year-old. "Are you warm now?" he asked. "Getting there," Virgil said. His voice thawed along with the rest of him had lost its usual authority. It was just a man's voice. "It works because of the frost line." Thomas said with the confidence of someone repeating information he has been told and found satisfying. The ground doesn't freeze below 4 feet. Mama explained it. Virgil looked at Thomas for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. She was at the shelf measuring out a small amount of the dried elderberry for herself. This time she had been ignoring her own cold for 2 days. She could feel him looking at her, and she let him look, because there was something he needed to reckon with, and it was not her job to make that easier or harder for him. After a moment, she heard him say very quietly to no one in particular, "She's right." He slept that third night on the floor of the shelter, wrapped in the spare blanket, his back against the earth wall. Eleanor slept too for the first time in 2 days, a sleep that was deep and dreamless, and lasted until Thomas woke her just before dawn by pressing his small hand against her cheek. "Mama," he said, "it's quiet." She lay still for a moment listening. He was right. The wind was gone. Not the slow fading of a storm that is still finishing gone. The particular silence of the prairie after a blizzard is unlike any other silence on earth. It has a specific weight to it, an almost physical quality of stillness, that is the negative image of everything the storm was. You can hear the absence of wind. You can hear it the way you hear a sound stop in a room where it has been constant as its own event, its own presence. Eleanor lay in the silence and thought 22 below zero for 4 days, and I am warm. She got up without waking the children. Virgil Cross was awake, already sitting against the wall with his knees up and his hands around a cup that must have gone cold hours ago. He looked at her when she rose, and she could see from his face that he had been awake for some time, thinking the kind of thoughts that a man thinks when the night gives him nothing else to do. She went to the stove and built a small fire for the morning's cooking. Corn mush again, the reliable staple, the thing she could make half asleep that would warm 3 children and cost nothing she didn't have. While the water heated, she went to the outer door and opened it. The cold reached her instantly, the specific cold of afterstorm, which is often colder than the storm itself, because the wind that had been moving air around has stopped, and the air has settled into its true temperature without motion to disguise it. She had to push the door against the snow that had drifted against the entrance, 6 inches of resistance, then it swung open. She stepped out into the world the storm had made. The prairie was white in every direction without limit or boundary, the snow smoothed to a surface like polished stone by the wind that had spent 4 days working it. The drifts were extraordinary. Against the north face of the hillside, the snow had piled to a height that would have covered a standing man past his waist. Along the fence line she had built to the east, it had drifted higher still, the tops carved into sharp horizontal ridges by the last gusts. The sky above was the clean, absolute blue that only happens after a major winter storm, a blue so clear it seemed close enough to touch, and the morning sun was barely up and already throwing long blue shadows across the snow from every small elevation. In the far distance, perhaps a mile to the northwest, she could see a thin line of smoke rising from the direction of the Garrett place. Thin, tired-looking, but there. Amos was up and tending his fire, and the Garretts had made it through. She stood in the cold for a moment longer, her breath making small clouds in the still air, and looked at what had been done to the world and felt the contrast between out here and back there behind her inside the hill, where the temperature had not changed. Then she went back in and made breakfast. When she came in, Virgil Cross was on his feet. He was moving carefully, still feeling the consequences of his exposure, but upright and functional, in the way of a man who decides to be functional, regardless of what his body is reporting. He had found the small hand brush she used for sweeping the chamber floor and had swept the area where he'd slept, neatening it without being asked, which was the kind of thing that told you more about a person than most things they said. She did not comment on it. They ate together, the 4 of them, and Virgil Cross around the small table that Eleanor had built from salvaged timber and set in the center of the chamber. It was the strangest breakfast of her life in some ways. The man who had tried to undo her work, eating her food in the structure his sabotage had failed to stop. She was aware of the strangeness of it. She thought the children were aware of it too, in their various ways. No one named it. After they ate, Eleanor told Clara to stay inside with Thomas until she came back. She told James he could come as far as the lean-to to check on the cow. She put on her coat and her heaviest boots and went out into the white morning. She was not thinking about Virgil Cross when she walked around the east side of the hill to check the shelter's exterior. She was thinking about Amos Garrett and what he had survived and what had happened to the others in the settlement and about the thin smoke lines she had seen to the northwest, and about what the days ahead looked like. She was not thinking about him, but she stopped when she came to the east face of the hill, where the entrance to the old collapsed dugout stood, and she looked at it, and she thought about what he had done in the dark on those 2 October nights, and she looked at the earth shelter that stood complete and intact beside it, and she thought about what Robert had written. Trust what you know. She had, and the knowing had held. She stood in the cold, bright morning, in the silence after the storm, with the snow brilliant around her, and the sky clean above her, and the smoke from the Garrett place rising thin and distant to the northwest. And she thought about what came next. The settlement would be learning its losses. Amos would be taking stock. People would be coming together as they did after catastrophes to account for the living and the dead. And when they came, when Amos rode over as she knew he would, preparing himself for the worst, what they found would not be what they expected. The temperature inside the shelter was 66 degrees. Thomas was recovering. Clara was reading. James had found the cow standing placidly in the lean-to, none the worse for 4 days of storm. And the woman who had buried her house in the hillside to save her children was standing in the snow outside it in the first light of the morning after the worst storm in a decade, with nothing in her hands but what she had built. It had been enough. It had been exactly enough. She went back inside. Virgil Cross was sitting against the earth wall with the cup in his hands again, the same posture he had taken when he first regained himself, knees up, back against the clay, the particular stillness of a man who has run out of the energy that argument requires. He looked up when she came in. "Your wall is solid," he said. It was not an apology. A man like Virgil Cross didn't move straight to apology. But it was something. It was a craftsman's acknowledgement, one builder to another, and from him it was more than most people would have offered. "Thank you," Eleanor said. She meant it. She hung up her coat. She went to the shelf where the tin box sat beside the blue glass from her mother's windowsill. She touched the lid of the box once briefly, the way you touch something that anchors you when the world has been moving fast. Then she turned back to the room. Her children were alive. Her shelter had held. The storm was over. Everything else would be settled in its own time. She picked up her notebook and opened it to the last page of temperature readings. 66 degrees. She wrote it down. Then she put the notebook back on the shelf and looked around the room at Thomas, lying on his bedroll, stronger than yesterday, at James coming in from the lean-to, with snow on his boots and good news in his face, at Clara closing the Bible and looking up with the expression of someone who has been waiting for the next chapter. At Virgil Cross, sitting against the wall of the earth, she had asked to hold her family, which had done exactly that. She had 4 people in this room breathing warm air in the middle of the worst winter Nebraska had produced in a decade. Outside, in the clean blue silence of the morning after Amos Garrett was saddling his horse, he was riding toward what he believed was a tragedy. He would arrive within the hour, and what he found would change the way the settlement understood everything it thought it knew about winter, about building, and about what a woman alone could do when she trusted the right things. Amos Garrett had buried 2 people in his life on the Nebraska prairie. The first was a young man from the settlement named Cobb, who had gone out in a storm to find a stray horse in the winter of 1861 and hadn't come back until spring, when the thaw revealed him in a draw 2 miles east of his own homestead, perfectly preserved by the cold, his face holding an expression of mild surprise that Amos had never quite gotten out of his memory. The second was a woman named Perkins, who had been alone when a fever took her in 1864, 3 days before anyone knew she was sick. Amos had helped dig both graves. He had spoken at both funerals. He had carried the specific weight of frontier loss, the kind that settles into a man who has lived long enough in a hard country to understand that the land does not negotiate. He had been awake for most of the 4 days of the storm, not because his own situation was desperate. His sod house had held as it always held, as he had built it to hold, but because his mind would not release the image of Eleanor Hale's shelter as he had last seen it in November. The low mound in the hillside, the small wooden door, the 3 children inside it. He had fed his stove every 2 hours through all 4 nights, burning through wood at a rate that alarmed Bess, while his internal calculation ran on a separate track beneath every practical task. He had checked his thermometer obsessively. At the storm's worst, with his 2 stoves running and his walls 4 feet thick in every direction, The inside of the Garrett house had dropped to 41 degrees. He had watched that number and thought about Eleanor Hale and her single small stove that she used only for cooking, and he had not slept more than an hour at a stretch. He had told Bess on the second night what he believed they would find when the storm broke. Bess had not replied. She had simply added more wood to the secondary stove and said a prayer in the low voice she used for prayers, the voice that meant she was asking for something she knew she might not receive. On the morning of the 21st, when the wind stopped and the sky cleared to that impossible December blue, Amos Garrett, dressed in every layer he owned, told Bess he would be back within 3 hours and saddled his horse. He rode slowly, not because the horse was reluctant. The horse was an animal of sound sense that had survived 3 Nebraska winters and knew how to move through deep snow, but because Amos was a man who had learned to postpone certain arrivals when possible. The smoke from his own chimney diminished behind him. The white prairie opened in every direction. The cold was extraordinary, the specific cold of afterstorm that has no wind to disguise it, settling against the skin with a quiet insistence that reminded you exactly what temperature meant. He could see the hail claim from half a mile out. The unfinished cabin frame stood above the snow line, its exposed timbers gray and ice-rimmed. The old dugout's entrance showed as a dark rectangle, and the hill with its strange low mound and its small wooden door. No smoke. He had expected no smoke because she had no chimney worth speaking of, but the absence of it still registered as evidence. He rode closer, and then he stopped his horse. Eleanor Hale was standing in the snow 30 yards from the shelter entrance, hanging laundry on the line she had strung between 2 fence posts on the south side of the hill. Her breath made small clouds in the still air. Her hands moved with the practical efficiency of a person doing an ordinary chore. Her dress was not heavy, a working dress, not the layered bulk of someone who had just come from a cold interior. She was not shaking. She turned at the sound of his horse and shaded her eyes against the morning sun. Then she lowered her hand and looked at him with the expression of someone who has been expecting company and is not entirely surprised by who has arrived. Amos Garrett sat on his horse in the snow and did not move for a long moment. He was 55 years old. He had spent 12 years on the Nebraska prairie. He had built one of the best structures in the county, and he knew exactly what it had cost him in fuel and effort to keep it above freezing through the last 4 days. He was a man who prided himself on understanding how things worked. He did not understand what he was looking at. "Eleanor," he said. His voice came out differently than he had intended, smaller. "Didn't expect company this early," she said. She had gone back to the laundry. "Come in. I've got coffee." He dismounted slowly, tied the horse to the fence post, followed her to the entrance. He had to duck to get through the outer door, then move through the entrance tunnel in a crouch and feeling the cold pool around his legs in the lower passage, exactly as Eleanor had described it to him in theory 2 months ago. Then the inner door, the 6-inch step up, and he was inside. The warmth reached his face before his eyes had adjusted to the lantern light. He stood in the entrance and felt it steady, present, real, and his mind did what minds do when they encounter something that contradicts a settled belief. It searched for an alternative explanation. There must be a fire somewhere. There must be a heat source he wasn't seeing. There must be something. There was nothing. The small iron stove in the corner was cold. Clara looked up from the table. James was beside Thomas on the bedroll, both of them watching Amos with the calm of children who live in a place where they are not afraid. Thomas looked thin, as if he had been sick and was recovering, but his color was good and his eyes were clear. And against the far wall, sitting with his knees up and his back against the earth, was Virgil Cross. Amos stopped. Virgil met his eyes. Neither man spoke for a moment. Amos looked at Virgil's face, at the remnants of cold damage still visible in his complexion. The particular look of a man who has been close to something and knows it and understood at least part of what had happened here without being told. Eleanor came in behind Amos and went to the stove and began building the fire for coffee with the same unhurried movements she used for everything. Amos reached into his coat and removed the thermometer he had carried in his breast pocket against his body to keep it functional. He held it up at arm's length away from himself and waited. The mercury climbed. He watched it. 65, 68, 70, 72. It stopped at 73. He looked at the number for a long time. Then he looked at the cold stove. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was not looking at him, who was measuring coffee grounds with the attention of someone for whom this particular moment had already been lived through somewhere in the long nights of calculation and doubt and work that had preceded it. Mariah, he said, and then stopped because that was not her name. Eleanor. His voice had done the thing again, reduced itself to something that did not fully sound like him. That's warmer than my house, with both stoves running the whole 4 days. I know, she said. How much did you burn? She nodded toward the wood box beside the stove. There was roughly 1/10 of a cord remaining from the small amount she had brought in for cooking. She had not touched the rest. Amos looked at the wood box. He thought about the cord and a half he had burned at his own place. He thought about what Bess had said on the second night about going through the emergency reserve. He thought about what he had heard from the Hutchinson boy who had ridden to fetch him at the storm's height about the state of the Hutchinson shanty chairs burned, then a small table, then a bed frame disassembled for fuel. He walked to the back wall and pressed his palm flat against it. The earth was cool to the touch. Not cold the way a stone in a shaded place is cool, the way something deep and patient is cool. And beneath that coolness, he felt what Eleanor had felt on the first night of the previous winter, what Robert had felt on cold nights, pressing his hand against the back of the old dugout. Something that wasn't heat in the active sense. Something older than that. The earth's memory of warmth stored and held and given back at the rate the earth decided, regardless of what the weather was doing on the surface. He stood with his hand against the wall for a long time. You built it like a battery, he said. Virgil Cross, from his position against the wall, said quietly, That's what the girl said. Clara looked up. She did not correct the attribution. She was watching Amos with her father's eyes, reading him the way her mother read weather. Amos turned from the wall and looked at the room, at the design of it, the thickness of the ceiling, the entrance tunnel, the ventilation shaft, all of it, with the eye of a man who has spent 12 years thinking about how to survive on the prairie and is now confronted with evidence that someone has thought about it differently and better. The tunnel, he said, the cold stays in the tunnel. It's heavier than warm air, Eleanor said, pouring coffee. It sinks. The step keeps it from reaching the floor of the chamber. 6 inches, Amos said. 6 inches. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the specific motion of a man recalibrating. Eleanor set a cup in front of him. He sat down at the table across from Clara, who closed her Bible and waited with the patience of a child who has learned that adults sometimes need a moment. What happened to the others? Eleanor said. She kept her voice level, but he could hear the weight behind it. She had been in this shelter for 4 days without news of anyone. Amos wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. Hutchinson's made it. The shanty took damage. Part of the east wall gave way on the third night. They moved into the corner and burned everything burnable. Ned's hands are frostbitten on 2 fingers. His wife is all right. The children are all right. Eleanor nodded. The Emlyn place, I don't know yet. I'll ride there after here. He paused. Theo Brandt's barn is gone. Roof collapsed under the snow load. He said the last part with a particular flatness that means a person is reporting loss while keeping their own reaction at a distance. Eleanor looked at Virgil Cross. He was looking at the floor. My place is gone, Virgil said. To the floor. To no one specifically. The roof went on the second night I got out. A pause. Barely. The room was quiet except for the sound of the fire Eleanor had built beginning to take hold in the small stove. You came here, Amos said to Virgil. It was not a question. I came here, Virgil said. Amos looked at Eleanor. She was at the shelf, her back to the room, and he could see in the set of her shoulders that she was giving Virgil Cross the space to say what needed saying or not say it without her presence making it harder. What happened next was something that Amos Garrett would describe in the years following as the most unexpected thing he witnessed in 30 years on the Nebraska frontier. He said it not because the frontier was short on unexpected things, it was full of them, but because of what it required of the man who did it. Virgil Cross put down his cup. He looked at Amos. Then he looked at the back of Eleanor's head. I tried to stop her, he said. His voice was level. Not confessional, a man like Virgil Cross did not do confessional, but precise the way a craftsman is precise, saying exactly what the thing was without decoration. I came twice at night in October and broke sections of the wall she'd built. The entrance wall, I thought. He stopped, pressed his lips together briefly. I told myself she was going to get those children killed, and I was preventing it. That's what I told myself. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Thomas shifted on his bedroll. Clara had gone very still. The truth, Virgil said more slowly, is that I'd told half the county it couldn't be done. By a woman who didn't know building. And I needed to be right about that. Amos had not moved. He looked at Virgil with the expression of a man who is hearing something that reshapes several previous months of stored memory. Eleanor turned from the shelf. She looked at Virgil Cross with an expression that had no anger in it that anyone in the room could see. There was something in it, but it was not anger. It was the expression of a woman who had known something for 2 months and had been waiting for it to find its own way into the room. I know, she said. Virgil looked at her. I found the marks both times, she said. I knew what made them. The room sat with that for a moment. Why didn't you, Amos began. Because it didn't matter, Eleanor said. She said it simply without drama. I repaired the damage and I built it better. Whatever he broke, I built back stronger because of it. By the time I was done, that entrance wall was better than my original design. She picked up the coffee pot and came to the table and refilled Amos's cup, and then without pausing, without making anything of it, she refilled Virgil's cup as well. Virgil Cross looked at the refilled cup for a moment. He had been a man of standing in this community for 20 years. He had been right about more things than he had been wrong about. He had built structures that were still standing and would be standing long after he was gone, and he had earned the respect he carried through the accumulated rightness of 2 decades of good work. He had also been wrong about this, wrong in a way that had cost him his home and nearly his life, and wrong in the second and deeper way, the way that had led him to walk onto another person's land in the dark and undo her work because he needed her to fail. He was 58 years old. He had enough years left to do something with the knowledge of what he had done, or not enough. That was the only question that remained. He picked up the cup. He did not say thank you because he did not yet have the words for everything that the thank you would have had to contain. But he picked up the cup and he drank, and Eleanor Hale moved back to her shelf and let the moment be what it was. Amos Garrett left an hour later with the thermometer reading still in his mind like a brand. 73 degrees, no fire. 4 days of the worst storm in a decade. He rode to the Hutchinson place first because it was closest. He found Ned Hutchinson outside assessing the damage to his east wall, with the expression of a man who has been frightened badly and is now converting that fright into anger at his own structure. Ned's hands were wrapped in cloth. His wife was inside with the children. Amos told him what he had found at the Hale place. Ned Hutchinson stood in the snow and listened with the particular expression of a man receiving information that conflicts with conclusions he has stated publicly and often. 73 degrees, Amos said. I read it myself. Her stove was cold. Ned said nothing for a moment. Then how the earth, Amos said. The design, she thought it through. Another silence. Ned looked at his damaged wall, at the blackened spot in the snow where he had thrown ash from his firebox, at the evidence of 4 days of desperate fuel management written all over the exterior of his own building. She said it would work, Ned said, almost to himself. He said it the way a person says something they heard and dismissed and are now reassessing. She did, Amos said. By afternoon, word was moving through the settlement the way word moves after a storm quickly between people who are already gathering to assess collective damage, pass from one set of hands to the next, accumulating detail, and losing some accuracy and gaining some emphasis the way information always moves among people in the aftermath of a catastrophe. But the core of it did not change because the core of it was a number, 73 degrees, no fire. And that number was verifiable because Amos Garrett had written it in his log, the date, the time, the condition, the reading in the same careful hand he used for everything he considered worth keeping. Dorothy Hutchinson came first in the early afternoon, riding hard enough that Eleanor heard the horse before she saw her. She came through the entrance tunnel without ceremony and stood in the chamber and felt the warmth and said nothing for a full minute, standing there with the look of a woman who has been frightened for days and has just been given permission to stop. Then she sat down at the table and Eleanor sat across from her and they talked the way women talk after a crisis has passed. Not about the crisis exactly, but around it, about the children and the stores and the spring and what needed doing next. And the warmth of the room was its own kind of conversation that ran underneath everything else. Bess Garrett came the following morning with her eldest daughter and a pot of something she had made from the last of her stored squash, and when she stepped into the chamber, she closed her eyes for a moment in the specific way of someone receiving something they had not dared to expect. "Oh, Eleanor," she said. "It's all right," Eleanor said. "I should have—" Bess started. "It's all right," Eleanor said again and meant it entirely. Ned Hutchinson came 3 days after the storm with his own thermometer, which he held up with the formality of a man conducting an official measurement, as if the officiousness of the gesture could account for the unofficiousness of everything that preceded it. The thermometer read 71 degrees. He wrote the number down on a piece of paper and put it in his pocket. He did not apologize. But he came back 2 days later with his oldest son and a question about the entrance tunnel design, and Eleanor answered every question with the straightforward patience of a woman who has no interest in being owed anything. The numbers, once they began circulating, did what numbers do among practical people who have just spent 4 days afraid. They settled the argument with the finality of evidence. Garrett household 1.5 cords burned. Inside temperature at storm's worst 41 degrees. Hutchinson household 2 cords plus furniture. Inside temperature at storm's worst 34 degrees with partial wall failure. 2 other households in the broader settlement had burned through everything combustible and still reported ice on interior walls. One family had lost their livestock shelter entirely. Eleanor Hale's shelter, 1/10 of a cord used only for cooking. Inside temperature at storm's worst 66 degrees. 0 structural damage. All 3 children and 2 adults accounted for and well. The numbers moved through the settlement like a correction. What happened with Virgil Cross in the weeks following the storm was not a single event, but a series of small ones, the kind of things that don't make a story in the moment, but add up to one in retrospect. He stayed at the Hale place for 2 days after the storm, while the settlement assessed what had survived and what needed rebuilding. He said little. He ate what was offered and helped where he could without being directed, splitting the small amount of firewood Eleanor needed for cooking, reinforcing the lean-to that sheltered the cow, clearing the drifted snow from the entrance to the old dugout that she used for storage. On the second day, he walked the exterior of the earth shelter slowly and completely, the way a craftsman walks a structure he is learning from. He studied the roof line, the entrance angle, the ventilation shaft, the way the hillside had been used rather than fought. He spent 20 minutes looking at the entrance tunnel's design. He crouched at the step, the 6-inch rise, and looked at it for a long time with the expression of a man recognizing an elegant solution he wishes he had thought of first. He said nothing about what he was doing. Eleanor let him do it. On the morning he left, he stood at the entrance to the shelter with his hat in his hands and looked at Eleanor. "I'm going to rebuild," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I'll do it right this time." He paused. "There are families in the settlement that need better shelter before next winter." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I'd like to use what you've built here," he said, "as the model, with my framing knowledge on top of it." It was the closest Virgil Cross could come in that moment to the full apology that the situation called for. Eleanor understood this. She understood that some men express contrition through what they build next rather than what they say, and that this was not a lesser form of it, just a different one. "I'll show you everything I designed," she said. "The angles, the depths, the tunnel dimensions. All of it. I won't pretend it's mine," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded once, the sharp nod of a man making a decision in the way that he makes decisions completely without ambiguity. Then he put his hat on and walked to his horse. Eleanor watched him go. She thought about what Robert had written. She thought about what it meant to trust what you know. She thought about the fact that the thing Virgil Cross had tried to destroy had in the end saved his life, and that whatever he built next would carry something of her design in it, and that this was not a victory exactly, but something more durable than a victory. A continuation. The way knowledge moves from one set of hands to the next, not always cleanly, not always with proper credit, but moving nonetheless. By March 4, families in the settlement had begun planning earth shelters for the following winter. Amos Garrett was one of them. Not to replace his sod house, the sod house was solid, and he was proud of it, and he should have been. But he added a room dug into the south-facing hillside behind the house, insulated with the same thermal mass principles Eleanor had used, designed as a sleeping room for the children that would stay warm at a fraction of the fuel cost. He asked Eleanor to review the design before he broke ground. She reviewed it and suggested two changes. He made both. Ned Hutchinson rebuilt his shanty entirely, this time with Virgil Cross's help, in Eleanor's design as the foundation. The new structure was a hybrid, Virgil's framing knowledge and woodworking craft, built on top of Eleanor's understanding of thermal mass and earth integration. It was the best building Ned Hutchinson had ever lived in. He acknowledged this to Amos Garrett quietly once and was not heard to say it again. A younger family named DeWalt, who had arrived in the settlement the previous summer and had been living in circumstances that made the Hutchinson shanty look palatial, came to Eleanor in early April and sat at her table and asked her to explain everything from the beginning. She explained it. They took notes. They began digging in May, and by October of 1868, they had the best insulated structure in the county, built by two people who had never built anything more complicated than a fence before. Nobody called them hail shelters. The frontier was not a place that named things after women who built them. But the knowledge moved through the settlement the way knowledge moves through places where people need it badly enough, directly, practically from the hands that held it first to the hands that needed it next. Virgil Cross built 3 earth shelters that spring and summer, working with families who asked for his help. He charged fair rates and used Eleanor's design with her full knowledge. On the first one, he came to her 3 times with questions about details he wanted to confirm. On the second, twice. On the third, he didn't come with questions because he had understood it thoroughly enough by then to carry it himself. He never said to Eleanor's knowledge a public word about what he had done on those October nights. The settlement knew because Amos knew, and Bess knew, and Clara was 12 years old and not entirely sworn to silence, though she kept more than most children would have. It was known the way things are known in small communities where everyone is too close to each other and the winters are too long, not spoken about in formal terms, but present in the air of every interaction. What Virgil Cross's public silence on the subject meant Eleanor eventually decided was less important than what his public work said. He was building what she had built. He was teaching it. He was putting his name and his labor and his 20 years of craft in service of a design that had proven him wrong in the most complete possible way. That was not nothing. That was perhaps everything a person in his position could offer. Eleanor accepted it. She had her shelter and her children and Robert's letter on the shelf and the spring coming up through the Nebraska soil with the particular insistence that spring on the prairie has pushing through everything that winter left behind. The years that followed were not easy. No years on the frontier were easy, but they were sustained. The shelter expanded twice as the children grew and the claim developed. Eleanor added a second room in 1869 and a third in 1871. Each one built on the same principles, each one adding to the thermal mass of the whole, so that the shelter became more stable with every addition, warmer in some ways than it had been in that first winter, because the earth had more of the family's warmth stored in it now. Years of it, the accumulated heat of living and cooking and breathing and sleeping pressed into the clay walls like a record. Clara grew into a young woman with her father's eyes and her mother's way of looking at a problem from every angle before she touched it. She married a man from the county seat in 1874 who was among his other qualities the kind of man who understood that his wife knew things he didn't and was made larger by that knowledge rather than smaller. They built their first home together using Eleanor's design, and when their own children asked why their house was different from other houses, why it was built into a hill, why it stayed warm on its own, why there was that strange step at the inner door, Clara told them about the winter of 1867 in a way that did not make it legend. She told it as fact, as knowledge, as a thing that worked because the person who built it paid attention. James became a farmer and a builder, competent and steady, the kind of man who shows up when neighbors need help and leaves before they feel obligated. Thomas, who had coughed through his early childhood and spent a terrifying night of fever during the worst storm in a decade, grew up in the warmth that the earth provided and outgrew his fragility, the way children sometimes outgrow the things that threaten them earliest, as if the body simply needed time and the right conditions. Amos Garrett lived to 78. He kept his logs until his eyesight failed, and in them, in the entry, for December 21st, 1867, he had written road to hail claim expecting the worst. Found thermometer at 73 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire burning, all alive and well. I have been building on this prairie for 12 years, and I have never been so thoroughly instructed. Bess Garrett, who had prayed on the second night of the storm in her low voice, that asks for things it knows it might not receive, lived to read that entry after Amos was gone, and kept the log and gave it to Eleanor on Eleanor's 60th birthday, along with a note that said only, "He thought you should have this." Virgil Cross rebuilt his own home in the spring of 1868 using the design he had learned from Eleanor's shelter, combined with his own craft. It was the best structure he ever built. He lived in it until he died in 1889, and it stood for another 30 years after that, longer than anything else he had built in his career. His name was on the building in the way that craftsmen's names are on things not written anywhere, but present in every joint and angle, in every choice that shows a man who has learned something and built from it honestly. Whether he ever fully reckoned with what he had done in the dark on those October nights was a question that belonged to him alone in the private accounting that every person keeps. What was visible was the work that followed, and the work said what it said. In the autumn of 1897, 30 years after the winter that had made it all consequential, a young homesteader came to Eleanor Hale's claim. He was perhaps 25, recently arrived from Pennsylvania, yet full of the particular energy of a person who has decided to build a life and is not yet sure how. He had heard about the earth shelter from the DeWalt family, who had heard about it from the family they had told. The chain of knowledge stretched now across 3 decades and several dozen structures across that part of Nebraska. He found Eleanor sitting on a low bench outside the main entrance to the shelter in the late afternoon light of an October day that had the same first bite quality as the October morning when she had driven her spade into the hillside for the first time. She was 64 years old. Her hair had gone entirely gray. Her hands, which had blistered through 6 weeks of digging in 1867, carried the specific topography of a life of physical work, not damaged exactly, but marked, recorded. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything for 30 years steadily, from a position of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything. He asked her where she had learned to build this way. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the shelter's entrance, at the low wooden door in the hillside, at the ground around it that showed no particular drama. Just earth, just a hill, just the place where a family had lived. Through a winter that had tested everyone and found most of them adequate and a few of them remarkable. She thought about her mother's root cellar in Kentucky. She thought about the back wall of the old dugout that had never frozen. She thought about Robert's letter, which she had read so many times in 30 years, that she no longer needed to unfold it to see the words. She thought about the spade in her hands on an October morning, and the hard earth, and the sound of her children working beside her, and the frost on the grass and November coming. "I didn't learn it," she said. The young man waited. "I remembered it," she said. "The earth had been doing this long before I asked it to. I just paid attention to what it was already doing." He nodded slowly in the way of someone who is going to need to sit with this for a while before it becomes fully useful. Eleanor stood. Her knees registered 30 years of Nebraska winters in the particular language of joints that have done serious work, but she was upright and she moved with the deliberate ease of someone who is comfortable in their own body after a long negotiation. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you how the entrance tunnel works. The angle matters. Most people get the angle wrong the first time." He followed her through the low outer door, through the entrance tunnel, in the half-crouch it required, up the 6-inch step and into the main chamber. The warmth touched his face before he could see the room clearly. He stopped, looked around, pressed his hand without thinking against the back wall, the earth wall, the wall that went straight into the hill and had been there before anyone built anything, and would be there after everyone had finished building. "It's warm," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. She went to the shelf where the tin box sat. Beside it, the blue glass from her mother's windowsill caught the last of the afternoon light coming through the ventilation shaft and held it the way the earth held warmth, not as possession, but as safekeeping. She touched the lid of the box once briefly, as she always did. "The walls store what you give them," she said. "Your warmth, your breath, your cooking, your living. They hold it and they give it back. The earth has a long memory." She looked around the room at the place where her children had slept through the worst storm in a decade, at the shelf where Robert's letter had sat for 30 years, at the step in the doorway that had kept the cold from reaching the floor, at everything she had built and everything it had held. "If you build with it instead of against it," she said, "it gives back more than you put in." Outside, the October wind moved across the Nebraska prairie the way it always had and always would, indifferent and constant, looking for the gaps in whatever human beings had built. The grass had turned the color of old bone. The sky was the particular gray of a season that knows what is coming and is not hurrying. Inside the hill, the temperature had not changed. It was the same as it had been in December of 1867, when the worst storm in a decade had come and gone and left the world white and the shelter standing. It was the same as it had been on every night since, through every winter, through every storm the prairie had produced in 30 years of testing every structure built on its surface. 68 degrees, the Earth's answer to everything the weather had ever asked it. The young man stayed for an hour and took careful notes and asked good questions, and Eleanor answered all of them. When he left, he rode south toward his own claim with the afternoon light behind him and the information in his hands, and he would build his shelter the following spring, and it would work because the design was honest and the earth was willing. And what Eleanor Hale had understood in the autumn of 1867 was true in ways that did not expire. Thin smoke rose from the ventilation shaft in the hillside, catching the last of the October light. The earth remembered what it had been given. It always had.